Now, I want to start by saying that the work that I'm going to be speaking about today comes from a project that I have been thinking about and working on and off for quite some time now. In fact, since something like 2017. But of course, given other research projects and priorities, I haven't been able to give it as much time as I've hoped, as I would have liked. So what that means is that despite this very long lean time, actually the work that I'm speaking about today is still very much a work in progress. So I'm really, really grateful for the invitation to speak at the seminar this afternoon, because it gives me such a wonderful opportunity to get some feedback partway through this research. Two more things that I wanted to say. The first is that, look, I'm aware that I have on my PowerPoint a different name, Michelle Pfeffer. I'm very sorry for the confusion. All I will say is that don't change your name when you're moving countries. Things get very complicated and confusing, but I can just confirm that Michelle Pfeffer and Michelle Aroney are in fact the same person, and that is the person who is on your screen right now. The second thing to say is, as you can see from my title, and if you've read my abstract, you'll see that I'm being a bit vague here already with the universities that I'm going to be speaking about today. And at the risk of being completely parochial, this afternoon I'm actually just going to be speaking about the cases of Oxford and Cambridge. But that being said, when it comes to the most general aim of this talk, I do think that the point is applicable to universities in other early modern contexts, including in the New World. And that general aim or point is to basically help champion disputation literature, which of course survives in different degrees, in different contexts, as a wonderfully rich archive that sheds a lot of fresh light on many different aspects of intellectual culture in the early modern period, including, of course, in this case, on the place of astrology in early modern academic life. But before we get to this, let's kick things off by zooming in to one particular disputation at the University of Oxford on one particular July day in the 17th century, in a building that is actually just about an 8-minute walk away from where I'm currently sitting. And that building is the Sheldonian Theatre, and we're traveling back to the year 1669, which was the year of its grand opening. And as you can see from the picture on the right, the Sheldonian still looks much the same today as it did in the 17th century, and it's still also used for at least one of its original purposes, which was graduation ceremonies. In the early modern period, Oxford graduation ceremonies were the basis of a 4-day event that was called the Commencement Act, which took place in the days preceding the second Monday of every July and was really the academic event of the year. The act, the Commencement Act, was also a major tourism event for the city itself, because as well as the solemn graduation ceremonies, it also featured public lectures, public sermons, and 2 days of public disputations, which is what we'll be talking about today, but also popular musical and theatrical performances, a lot of feasting and drinking, and also what was in essence a series of stand-up comedy routines by the music lecturer, but also by the official university fool or jester, who at Oxford was called the terrae filius. So visitors came to the city to visit the colleges, to explore their grounds, to explore their libraries, and whatever other exciting artifacts the university put on display. For example, in the year 1676, according to Robert Plot, there was a living elephant shown publicly over the course of the festivities. So it's perhaps no surprise that these events drew crowds from all over the country, including, of course, friends and family of graduating students, but also scholars from Cambridge. So, for example, in the year 1669, the year that we're looking at right now, there were apparently about 200 of them. But we also have professionals and scholars from around the country and also from abroad, as well as visiting dignitaries from London and from overseas and their retinue that came with them, as well as elites from other cities and even just locals in the Oxford area who were unconnected to the university. Now, as much as the plays and especially the rowdy speeches of the terrae filius, as pictured here on the right, titillated the crowds, the real culmination of the festivities were the public disputations in philosophy, law, medicine, and most importantly, theology that took place on the Monday, the final day of the Act. And in this year, they were taking place for the first time in the Sheldonian. So these disputations were the final formal requirement for students incepting to the MA, as well as students taking doctoral degrees in the higher faculties. So this Monday was the commencement act proper, the act as it was often called, and it began with students gathering for solemn prayers in the university church before processing, much like in the image here, to the Sheldonian with their professors, where the waiting crowds were gathering. And in what must have been a rather daunting experience of all of the incepting students from the MAs up to the doctors, it was actually the most junior ones who were going to be disputing first. And in fact, according to the statutes, just one brave arts student was required to respond to 3 questions in philosophy on behalf of all of his peers. So in 1669, that big responsibility fell to the young 21-year-old William Hopkins, who was studying at St. Mary Hall, pictured here, which is actually a college that isn't around anymore. And as was standard, Hopkins was required to respond to questions that were chosen by the university's body of academics, which was called the congregation. And as Hopkins prosecuted his case, he was required by statute to respond periodically to the counter-arguments of 5 more senior opponents, one of which was the terrae filius, the jester. And this year, the terrae filius' speeches were so scandalous and frankly smutty that they gave, to quote one contemporary, offence to all honest spectators, leading the vice-chancellor to first imprison him and eventually expel him. Now, Hopkins' first 2 questions, as you can see from this broadsheet, were rather traditional, somewhat lackluster topics. But his third question is what interests us today, and which I think also likely pricked up the ears of many in the crowd. His question was, can the astrologer predict future contingencies? And the answer, chosen in advance and approved by the congregation, so by the body of academics, was no. That a negative answer to this question was set by congregation in 1669 is really not all that surprising. Astrology, of course, had long been a fixture of the 7 liberal arts that were taught at universities across Europe, the philosophical foundations of which were taught in natural philosophy and some of the practical uses of which were taught in medicine. But by 1669, astrology had long been marginalized in European academia, and particularly in England, where astrology had never quite managed to find the same kind of institutional footing as it did in many other European countries. But if Hopkins' answer then is not surprising, I think that the question that he was set rather is. Out of the vast ocean of the subjects that made up the BA and MA courses that were taught at Oxford, astrology really was a rather small island, even in its best and its strongest years, and one that by 1669 hadn't been formally taught for quite some time. So it's therefore quite remarkable, I think, that out of just the handful of philosophy questions that were disputed across the course of the Commencement Act, the university felt the need to set one on astrology. And this was, furthermore, as we'll see today, far from the only time that astrology was disputed at the Oxford Act, or indeed the Cambridge Act, into the 17th century, and in fact into the 18th century as well. So in other words, a period of great philosophical renewal, development, and controversy, much of which was making its way into the core curriculum of universities, but was only infrequently debated at the Act. And meanwhile, the first statutes explicitly banning the teaching of astrology at Oxford date back to 1619 rather. Unfortunately, beyond Hopkins' question and his answer, and of course his identity, his college, and his faculty, no further archival evidence of his disputation has survived that might shed light on why this topic was chosen. And this archival situation is unfortunately the case for the majority of Oxford commencement disputations. And this is in sharp distinction to what we have for many universities across Europe, particularly in the German-speaking lands, in the Low Countries, and even in Scandinavia. And this is in large part because from the 16th century onwards, the theses of disputants were commonly printed in advance in those contexts. They were spread widely, and they frequently survive today. And this was just not the case in Oxford. In Cambridge, we're in slightly better territory than in Oxford, in that the poetic verses that were written to accompany the disputations often survive. But even then, the verses could be quite tangential to the topic at hand and don't always provide the kind of contextual detail that we're looking for. However, part of the reason why I'm focusing just on Oxford and Cambridge today, which from now on I'm just going to call Oxbridge, is because I want to make the, I suppose, kind of methodological point that even when there's little surviving evidence of what actually took place at a disputation, we can nevertheless learn a great deal from even just the questions, which do survive, and of course the answers, as well as from the identity of the respondent, and more particularly from the broader institutional, intellectual, cultural, and often even political context at the time the question was chosen. And it's this last point that helps us to think about why Oxbridge would bother setting questions about astrology at the Commencement Act during a period when it had well and truly been expelled from formal curricula. For when we look to the timing of these disputations, that is the years in which questions on astrology were chosen, what we find is that there's almost always a very, very obvious connection to some broader debate about astrology, which was sometimes taking place within the university, but more often in the public sphere. And here, of course, it's important to recall that public disputations at Oxford were just that, public, just as graduation disputations generally were on the continent. Disputations were the bread and butter of university pedagogy, with students attending really many dozens across the course of their degrees. And while most of these were formative, and in Oxford and Cambridge at least took place in the students' faculty or in their college, and thus were relatively private, disputations for graduation were open to members of the public. And today I want to stress that at Oxbridge, this was not just open to the public in theory, but as a large amount of contemporary evidence attests, also in practice. So what this meant, I think, was that the Act was an opportunity for the university to take a public stand on issues of public debate, meaning that moments like Hopkins' disputation served more than just a pedagogical or kind of formal administrative role. Once a year, the university had the unrivaled opportunity not only to remind its members of the line that they should be taking on certain controversial issues, but also to shape and to steer public opinion, in this case, in the direction of the marginalisation of astrology. And this is, I think, what is happening in the case of the many commencement disputations at Oxbridge on astrology in the early modern period. And this is the direction we'll be moving in for the rest of my talk. But first, a few words are in order about the place of astrology in early modern Oxbridge. So in recent years, we've been fortunate to learn a great deal about the teaching of astrology in late medieval and Renaissance universities across Europe. And when it comes to England, much of what we know comes from the work of the people on the screen here, who have shown that although astrology never got anywhere near as strong a foothold in Oxbridge as it did in somewhere like Italy, for example, Oxbridge students who found themselves interested in astrology could nevertheless find ways of learning the art. And although the evidence is very thin, it's clear enough that the natural philosophical foundations of astrology and theories, in particular theories of celestial influence in general, were taught, along with some astrological principles. And deeper study was possible with the help of a passionate tutor, particularly if you were in a college where the library was stacked with astrological texts. For the early modern period, Motti Feingold in particular has shown the extent to which Oxbridge scholars felt the need to limit or to tone down their teaching and their research in astrology in order to appease elite patrons, at the same time as they might actually end up engaging extensively in private study and teaching, and often even private astrological practice. So though a lot of late 16th century students, for example, left Oxbridge entirely disillusioned with astrology, many others left with a lifelong passion for it. And it often depended on the student's particular tutor and their college. Now, something a little bit clearer than this ambivalence came with the Civilian Statutes of 1619, which were set up when Henry Saville endowed the chairs of geometry and astronomy. And famously, these statutes quite clearly banned the professor of astronomy from teaching all judicial astrology without exception. So some have taken the use of the word judicial here to mean that natural astrology, so that is astrology, that was used as it's commonly thought for medicine, navigation, and agriculture, that natural astrology may have been acceptable. But I don't think this was the case, at least from Saville's perspective, because if we read what Saville himself actually says elsewhere about astrology, what we find is that he's actually pretty consistently dismissive of all attempts to make judgments based on the stars. So what Saville meant, I think, by judicial astrology in his statutes is what most of his contemporaries in England and in Europe in the centuries before him would have meant, which is something more just like predictive astrology, which in fact included natural astrology, even, for Saville, things like weather prediction and even medical prognosis, which he placed in opposition to mathematical astronomy. So what this means is that even though it's only the civilian professorships that, of course, fell under the civilian statutes and therefore under the remit of this ban, so of course this can't speak to the teaching of natural philosophy or medicine. What we do have in 1619 is a very clear and high-profile statement against the teaching of astrology in Oxford. Okay, so let's turn then to the disputations. So even though I'm going to be focusing on public graduation disputations today, I thought it was worth pointing out that we do have some records of formative and more private disputations that students were required to participate in throughout their degrees. As you can see, for example, astrology was quite a common topic in the disputations required for inception in the BA, for example. These took place in Lent, and at Cambridge were called tripos disputations. But astrology also appeared in a number of essentially special events that were put on for visiting dignitaries, including the Queen. And there were also, again, other disputations held when, for example, scholars were elected to college fellowships, as well as dozens and dozens of practice disputations, for which, unfortunately, we really do have very little, if any, information. But this is just to kind of give you a background. Astrology is disputed, oftentimes in negative ways, as you can see, in fact, almost always in negative ways. But what I really do want to focus on today are the public graduation disputations. At Oxbridge, as I've suggested already, these took place over 2 days. At Oxford, first on a Saturday, and then the act proper, the final day on the Monday. And at Cambridge, first on commencement eve, and then on commencement day. And at Cambridge, these ceremonies were held a little earlier in July, so as to avoid clashing with the Oxford Act. Now, I've hinted that what we know about the Cambridge disputations comes from the verses that were printed, many of which, but far from all, have survived. And an example here is on the left, and at least not so much of the verses, but the theses rather at Cambridge have been really helpfully, wonderfully edited in this wonderful book by J.J. Hall. This is my very, very worn copy, but this really is an invaluable addition for anyone working on disputations at Cambridge. Meanwhile, what we know about the Oxford disputations comes from the Register of Congregation. I said that congregation often is set, and sometimes when students chose questions, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, congregation nevertheless still had to approve them, so they were written down in the register. And so in these registers, which cover many, many volumes between roughly the 1570s and the 1730s, we have the questions, we have the answers, and we have the students and their subjects and their colleges. And these are covering, of course, a really wide variety of topics in all of the different faculties at Oxford and at Cambridge. So how often does astrology appear in these records? Well, at Oxford, in the roughly 160-year period covered by the records, there's something like 25 commencement disputations directly on astrology, as well as more on related topics like foreknowledge and on divination, at which I think it's very likely astrology was also discussed. Meanwhile, for the same period at Cambridge, where our records are much slimmer, I'm only confident at least of about something between 7 and 14. A lot of the verses are not clear about whether or not the disputation was taking place at the Act or was in fact a private disputation. So we've got to be a little bit careful there. So between 7 and 14 at Cambridge and something like 25 at Oxford. Now, at first, we might think this is quite a small proportion of the topics that were publicly disputed at Oxford in this period. But I do think that these stats are in large part a consequence of the makeup of the student body, as well as the format of commencement disputations. So in regards to the latter, at Oxford, for example, On the Saturday, so the first day of disputations, just one incepting MA student responded to 3 questions in philosophy on behalf of its peers. Meanwhile, all incepting bachelors in the higher faculties of medicine, law, and theology were each required to dispute on 3 questions. So meaning that in some years you might have, for example, 10 incepting doctors in divinity, each of which had 3 questions, plus some more medical doctors, for example. So these questions in the other faculties do add up. On the Monday, things are a little more balanced across the faculties. A single MA student, again, well, in this case, actually, it's a bit more complicated, but basically you do have just, again, 3 questions in philosophy. And in the other 3 higher faculties, you have 3 questions, and this time the incepting doctors all oppose in turns, one after the other. And what this means, in other words, is that even though there's almost always more art students graduating in a given year than in any of the 3 higher faculties, there would only ever be 2 sets of philosophy questions at the ACT. And at Cambridge, things are a bit different. You only have 2 questions, or rather, actually, at Cambridge, they're theses proposed. So given that theology was by far the largest of the higher faculties at Oxford, what this meant in practice was that the ACT was a theology-heavy event. So, in fact, when we consider just how wide-ranging the arts curriculum was and the sheer amount of philosophical topics covered by students, it's no surprise that astrology appears in these records relatively infrequently. In fact, given this situation, we may well be very surprised that astrology comes up as often as it does. I mean, 25 astrology disputations at Oxford, for example, in a 160-year period means there's on average a disputation on astrology just over every 6 years. And in fact, we can kind of finesse these stats even more, because we've got to bear in mind that at both universities, the ACT was very frequently cancelled. Sometimes for political reasons, economic reasons, sometimes because there were too few inceptors or no theology inceptors, for example, and sometimes simply just because of plague. At Oxford, for instance, between the 1570s and the 1730s, so the coverage of the records, the ACT is held actually only just over 50% of the time. So then, of the years that the ACT was actually held, astrology ends up being publicly disputed on average just over every 3 years. And I think that's quite remarkable. So disputations on astrology at Oxbridge were fairly well spread across this 160-year period, although they did become more infrequent in the later 17th century, but this is also when the ACT is held much more infrequently. If we were to distill, I think, the most common position on astrology presented across all disputations at Oxford and Cambridge, it would be that the general principle of celestial influence was more or less accepted, but that the making of predictions about the impact of that influence on Earth was without scientific or religious foundation. And this is thrown into sharp relief at the Oxford Act of 1614, where the incepting MA student, who was Henry King of Christchurch, was to respond on behalf of his peers to 2 astrological questions, the first of which asked whether the lower world is ruled by the superior, yes, and the second of which asked whether conjectures about the future could be made from observing the heavens, no. Indeed, disputations that argued for the reality of celestial influence were relatively common across both universities and even into the 18th century, but it really was prediction that was at issue. Many at astrology argued that astrologers could not produce certain predictions, especially about contingent things, and others argued that prediction was just completely illicit for Christians. At Cambridge, the focus is a little bit more about whether or not astrology worked, or whether it's just a matter of guesswork, for example, or conjecture with no scientific foundation. And some Cambridge students also went as far as to argue that astrologers were deliberately deceitful. There were nevertheless some outliers to this generalized position. So, for example, an MA student in 1593 argued that political affairs follow the heavens, and a similar point was made about comets 30 years later. And most notably, I think, at the Act of 1676, an incepting MA student argued that human free will was subject to the stars. And this is a really shocking position to be defending in the 1670s. But 5 years later, another student made it clear that this was completely wrong. Now, I've said that disputations on astrology were pretty well spread across the period, but there were particular decades where astrology came up much more frequently. And this is the case for the 1580s and the 1650s at both institutions, as well as the 1600s at Cambridge. And I'll be speaking about these three cases for much of the rest of my talk. What I'm interested in is that these decades were key moments of debate about astrology within the university, but also within the public sphere more generally. But even beyond these hotspot moments, it's in fact possible to connect almost every single public disputation on astrology in the early modern period to some public discussion that was happening either in the same year or the year before. So with this in mind, before turning to our little case studies, I think it's important to return to the fact that these events had a public-facing role. So we've already gotten a glimpse of the types of people who were present at the 1669 Act at Oxford. So we know that a wide variety of people were present. We could think of current movers and shakers, as well as future ones. But in reality, the Commencement Act was held before Town and Gown. And so we have many, many people, and in fact, many thousands attending the festivities, so much so that it really, as I mentioned before, had to be shut down in plague years. So evidence from correspondence and from diaries provides us with more fine-grained detail about the identities of those who were present. And it's significant, I think, that this also included women. So John Evelyn, for example, brought his wife to the Oxford Act in 1654, and the antiquarian William Fulman also brought his missus in 1676. The presence of women in normally male spaces was very hard to ignore, and many jokes were made in the jesters' speeches about how distracted the young male students were because of this. As Christine Haugen has noted, while women were present, they were rarely made to feel welcome. So, for example, in 1631, the jester at Cambridge began his speech by welcoming all the men in the room, and he deliberately explained that he came to the women last in his introductions because they scarcely listen or understand anything at all. And of course, he said all of this in Latin, so it would have gone over the heads of many of the women present. So meanwhile, at Oxford, the music lectures were typically given in English specifically for the benefit of the women in the room. But at the same time, these lectures were often almost entirely preoccupied with insulting them. In 1656, one woman took offense at this and loudly intervened in the middle of a lecture, complaining about the speaker's treatment of women, but this only led the lecturer to make jokes at her expense, prompting her to sit down in deep embarrassment, apparently sort of covering her face with her hood. That women were nevertheless expected to be present every year is suggested by surviving broadsheets like the one on the right here, which were posted around Oxford in anticipation of the Act and stipulated the seating arrangements within the Sheldonian Theatre. So specific seats were allocated for members of the university according to seniority, but also to the various visitors, so men from Cambridge, the musical performers, butlers, servitors, and persons of promiscuous quality, and also ladies and gentlewomen. According to the statutes, those chosen to be curators every year had the responsibility to make sure all of these people sat in the correct seats. So seating plans such as these were part of the efforts at both universities to control what was really the general public chaos of the Act, because the reputation of the university was at stake during these events. At Cambridge too, things were quite busy and chaotic. We know that at the commencement eve of 1620, for example, it was so busy that one attendee found that he had to arrive extra early to make sure that he got a seat for the disputations. But the next day, on commencement day itself, he failed to do so, and he struggled in a very difficult seat. Joseph Mead, a fellow at Christ's at Cambridge, recalls that the amount of people in the commencement house was so great that the crowd sways sometimes on one side, and then they that are crushed on the walls cry out, "Oh, oh." And being sensible of the pain, they set their feet against the walls, and with their backs, they push with all their strength to the other side. And then the people on the other side cry out, "Oh, oh," and so it goes. Similarly, while at the Oxford Act of 1640, one man, Nathan Walworth, found himself merry amongst the doctors in the midst of their disputations, where I was like to have my belly burst and my ribs broken in the crowd, my shirt stuck to my back and sweat trickling down my cheeks. So the consciously public nature of the disputations then explains, I think, why more generally disputations on other subjects, so besides astrology, were also often chosen at key moments of public debate. And this is in contrast to the editor of the Oxford Disputations up to 1622, who noted a singular barrenness in contemporary allusions, which I don't quite think is the case. At Cambridge in 1599, for example, a theology disputation on demonic possession immediately followed a high-profile controversy involving the famous exorcist John Darrell. And disputations often followed new publications, they followed new theories, or even in the 17th century, new experiments, such as blood transfusions. In these cases, the topics usually had public resonance, as, for example, a disputation that followed a high-profile defense of polygamy. The political situation, as you can see, could also prompt disputations. As we can see from the screen, this ranged from the gunpowder plot to the founding of Virginia, to even the planting of silkworms by royal decree. And this was also the case in regards to astrology, where, for example, the defeat of the Spanish Armada prompted an Oxford disputation in 1589, as you can see. And astronomical phenomena like comets and new stars could also prompt disputations. Right. Time then to run through some of our short case studies, and we're going to start with Cambridge in the 1580s. So this was a decade in which astrology was debated several times at the Act, which makes sense, I think, given the fact that in this decade, there was much public discussion about astrology in England. And this is partly in response to the fallout of the predictions that related to the comet of 1577, as well as an Elizabethan law of 1581, which is on the screen here, which was against casting horoscopes for royalty without their permission upon penalty of death. But given that the first relevant disputation of astrology in Cambridge in this decade took place in July 1583, the key context, I think, must be the debate that unfolded when Richard Harvey published a prognostication in early 1583, so in the same year, about a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn that was set to take place in 1588. Harvey's predictions prompted a slew of responses, including from astrologers who supported him, astrologers who disagreed with him, as well as anti-astrological writers. Harvey's prognostication had been quite emphatically negative, predicting numerous disasters, and it had such a cultural impact that one contemporary claimed that it was rife in everyone's mouths, while another said that the song for half a year was nothing else but the conjunction, the conjunction. Given the general panic then that Harvey's prognostication elicited, I think it's no surprise that the university felt the Act to be an opportune time to take a stand, but also to offer comfort. For if, as the disputation must have argued, the predictions of astrologers were not demonstrative knowledge, but rather guesswork, then there was no need to fear. Now, the debate that Harvey's predictions prompted has been studied by several historians, most notably Margaret Aston. But something that I don't think has been given quite serious attention is the fact that almost all of these writers were themselves based at Cambridge, as you can see on the screen, many of whom were just a year or two below Harvey himself, who, along with his two brothers, John and Gabriel, were very much social outsiders in the university. And it's therefore unsurprising that ridicule of Harvey and his brothers and their apparently embarrassing obsession with astrology was the talk of the town in Cambridge. As one contemporary put it, the whole university hissed at him. There were even multiple plays set in Cambridge that parodied Harvey and his brothers, not least one called Dick Harvey in a Frenzy, that apparently made Richard Harvey so angry that he smashed the college windows at Peterhouse where the play was being performed, and was eventually put in stocks for the rest of the evening, much to the laughingstock of the university. In the case of the 1583 disputation, then, I think the Act could also be about, in some ways, disciplining members of the university, ensuring that they kept in line with the official view. Because after all, although the position defended publicly at the Act may have been an attempt to put forward a united front, Oxford was far from united about astrology. Likely everyone in the crowd that July day in 1583 knew that the disputation was directed at the Harveys, who had become something of a laughingstock, both in the university and beyond. So I think part of the purpose of public disputations in this sense is also a way to remind sort of dissidents to kind of keep in line, as well as to remind the outside world what that line was. For our next case, we're going to jump ahead 10 years to a disputation held at Cambridge in 1603. And this disputation concerned the thesis that the judicial art of the astrologer is mere imposture on the world. In this case, while we don't know who the incepting MA student was, we're exceptionally lucky to have a 50-page manuscript in the Saville collection in the Bodleian by the same title, which from its generic markers seems, I'm pretty confident, to be an expanded version of their remarks. I won't say much about the manuscript today, which I'm still working on. But what I will say briefly is that the author basically begins by separating the deep histories, the ancient histories of astrology and astronomy, making clear that while astronomy was, accepted by the best ancient mathematicians, astrology was rejected. And the author then goes on to explain that even though there's been so many successful attempts to disprove astrology, defenders of it keep coming forward, they keep reappearing, and so they must continuously be cut off, more or less like Hydra heads. Now, this disputation too was prompted by debates in the public sphere that had a connection with Oxbridge. And this time we're looking at the high-profile dispute between the astronomer and mathematician John Chamber and the astrologer Christopher Hayden. So Chamber, who had spent many years at Oxford as both a fellow and a lecturer in various subjects, had already been deeply critical of astrology in an oration he delivered to students as the introduction to a lecture series on Ptolemy's Almagest in the 1570s. So after singing the praises of astrology, Chamber came to the vain astrologers, whom he just sort of goes on to chastise. So he says, there's no divination by the stars. It's not possible to foretell a man's disposition from his nativity. Okay, fine. He says they very occasionally get things right, but this is no surprise. He says, if you're shooting all day long, it's no surprise that you're every now and then going to hit the mark. So Chamber concludes really strongly by saying, as for their profession, I utterly renounce it. In 1601, Chamber published a treatise against judicial astrology, which, amongst other things, asked for astrology to be outlawed in the country. He claimed to be surprised that a heathenish superstition, as he put it, could have been accepted in Christian society for so long. And he went on to launch various attacks at aspects of astrological theory and practice. In early 1603, a very, very long response was published by Christopher Hayden, who was defending astrology. So Hayden studied at Peterhouse, Cambridge, and had many ongoing connections with the university, not least with John Fletcher, who was a fellow at Caius, who not only helped him to write this book, but also cast for him the nativity of his son. So Hayden declared that he felt it necessary to respond because Chambers had written his critique of astrology in English, in the vernacular, rather than in Latin. And Hayden now saw it as his responsibility to essentially translate a long series of defenses of astrology that had previously only been in Latin, so that the public debate would be a little bit more balanced. Now, a published reply from Chambers never appeared, but what did appear, of course, was that 1603 Cambridge disputation, which I think functioned in this case also as a reminder to those at Cambridge where the university stood on astrology. Notably, Chamber did actually write a reply, which is on the right. This survives also in the Bodleian Library. And in it, he actually praises the 1603 disputation, which he clearly saw as having done some of the heavy lifting for him. For our next case, we move to Oxford, where this time the disputation in question is not that of a young student, but instead by no less than the civilian professor of astronomy. In 1654, that man was Seth Ward, who was by then a much acclaimed disputant. So before taking up his Oxford post, Ward had studied at Sydney Sussex College at Cambridge from 1632. And when he was ready to determine for his BA in 1636, he rather unusually disputed astronomical questions, topics which were usually reserved for those determining for the MA. But his reputation as an orator was growing. In 1640, the year he took his MA, he was chosen by the vice chancellor to serve as the Cambridge equivalent of the Terrae Filius. But the Vice-Chancellor came to regret his choice because even though Ward apparently satisfied or entertained at least the audience, Ward's remarks offended the Vice-Chancellor greatly, who went on to suspend him from his studies, only to reverse this decision the next day. But Ward then went on to serve as mathematical lecturer for several years before moving to Oxford, taking up his civilian chair in 1649, where again his rhetorical skills were valued. And it was here at Oxford that he cut his theological teeth. So he starts working towards the DD, the Doctor of Divinity, and in this process, he gives a number of sermons on theological, as well as theological lectures, but he also participates in divinity disputations. And here, perhaps unsurprisingly, he brings astronomy into the discussion. So while serving as the opponent in one particular important disputation at the Act of 1653, which was the doctoral disputation of Henry Wilkinson, who had just been elected Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity, Wilkinson basically addresses two questions about the sanctity of the Sabbath. And when it was his turn to oppose, Ward questioned him by objecting that the limits of any Sunday were fluid and varied according to travel and geography. And Wilkinson was really unimpressed, and he dismissed these arguments as mere astronomy. But all of this work in theology, which he kept connecting to his astronomical interests, culminated in Ward being made Doctor of Divinity, an honor he received in 1654, actually alongside his counterpart chair in geometry, John Wallis. To be made DD formally, Ward was required to choose and then to respond to 3 theological questions at the Act. And as we can see, it's his last question that concerns us, whether prophetic astrology is empty and illicit. And as befitted a civilian professor, Ward's answer is, of course, yes. Now, it's notable that all of the examples of astrology disputations that I've shown so far were debated by arts students, but this is, of course, a theology disputation. So at Oxbridge, astrology very, very rarely was disputed in theology at the Act, where incoming doctors tended to dispute about pressing confessional issues. And given the by now decades-long legacy of civilian professors, not only not teaching astrology to their students, but also being openly critical of astrology in their publications and also amongst their friends, it might seem that there was little need for Ward to bother in 1654 to attack astrology. But of course, there is once again crucial context that explains Ward's choice of this question. So more generally, in the 1650s, there's a number of astronomical events which had elicited more or less terrifying prognostications from astrologers, led to widespread panic, most notably to the so-called Black Monday eclipse of 1652, and also to a comet in the same year, which had actually themselves, these phenomena, prompted Oxford disputations against astrology already in 1651 and 1653. Ward was, of course, well aware of these phenomena, for not only did his colleagues take careful observations of the comet, for example, but he also took the opportunity of the comet's appearance to publish some of his Oxford lectures in 1653, in which he explicitly sidelined astrological prognostication, maintaining that the heavens were basically unconcerned with our lesser and insignificant lives. The 1650s were also the peak years of the newly formed Society of Astrologers, a group that was dedicated to the rehabilitation of astrology, and its number included a number of prominent mathematical practitioners, most notably William Oughtred, with whom Ward was in contact. Society meetings in 1649, 50, 51, 52, and 53 had all produced printed sermons in defense of astrology that drew quite a lot of attention and prompted a fresh wave of anti-astrological literature. But crucially, the Society's success had been much praised in John Webster's famous text here, which is here on the screen. And this is a text that, as some of you may know, held Seth Ward's attention in 1654. So this is a critique of the universities written by someone who had studied chemistry and medicine informally before working as a cleric and later schoolmaster. In it, Webster defended the study of astrology, which he believed the universities had wrongly neglected. And, he says at the universities, they're just preoccupied with scoffing at it rather than taking it seriously. In his view, astrology was noble and useful, even if many imposters had unfortunately tarnished his reputation. So Webster praises the Society of Astrologers for their efforts to resuscitate and promote their art. After seeing Webster's book, Ward is more or less furious, and he begins to collaborate with his friend John Wilkins, eventually producing his now famous response, which defended the universities against Webster's insults and stood quite explicitly alongside, in favor of, the university's sidelining of astrology. Taking up Webster's complaint that the universities do not teach astrology, Ward called astrology a ridiculous cheat made up of nonsense and contradictions that philosophers and mathematicians had now outgrown. He then pulled apart key aspects of practical astrology, including the houses of the horoscope, the aspects of the planets, and the signs of the zodiac, which he believed were arbitrary human constructions. So Webster's manifesto thus, I think, provides the crucial context for Ward's choice of an astrological question at his divinity disputation, and Ward's book, which appeared by at least early September of that same year, was, I would conjecture, in part worked out on the disputation floor in July. The disputation itself was also a way for Ward to declare that he thought the university's position in this what he thought the university's position in this debate was. And Ward is actually quite clear in his book that that public disputations are a fair representation of what the university's official position should be on certain controversial issues. And incidentally, Thomas Hall, who also responded to Webster, made mention in his own book of a Cambridge disputation that took place in the same year, 1654, which does not survive in the archives, and we have no verses for it, and we only know about it because of Hall's book, of a disputation that argued that judicial astrology is not a science. So clearly both universities felt the need to take a stand against Webster that year. Okay, let's begin to draw some conclusions. So my overall point today has been that disputations on astrology at Oxbridge were almost always responding to debates in the public sphere, or also sometimes in the university itself. And this helps to explain, I think, why astrology continued to be debated long past the point where it was taken seriously by many people in these institutions. This is in large part, I think, because the university and its members felt it had to take a public stand on astrology at certain points in time, essentially functioning, much as they thought that they were, as the intellectual leader in English society. So building on early Enlightenment critiques, university disputations have often been dismissed as fossilized hangovers of medieval scholasticism, rote exercises and empty rituals, set pieces, even for one historian, mere academic display. The debates, it has been said, were not serious, and they were typically on inconsequential, boring, repetitive topics. Thankfully, these long-standing assumptions are now being thoroughly undermined by a number of really important studies on disputations across Europe that have built on some of the earlier work of isolated pioneers who've worked on disputations. I would even almost say that disputations are now somewhat in vogue, as new work continues to show how useful they are for studying the development of the history of particular fields, or as a litmus test for the religious or political situation at an institution, and even the intellectual development of individuals. And the recent book on the screen is just one of many examples. Disputations are a hugely important source for intellectual historians of all fields. And this really is an archive of such vast proportions, because really the records of many, many thousands of disputations survive, that it's not soon to be exhausted. And it's also important, I think, to note that these records are in reality valuable traces of oral culture, something that is, of course, notoriously difficult for pre-modern historians to access. And given, I think, the fact that the vast majority of intellectual exchanges at universities was taking place orally, I think it's really important that we try to recover as much of this oral culture as we can. So disputations were, pedagogically speaking, a useful tool for teaching the rhetorical skill of argumentation, for showing how to defend truth against error. And in the case of public disputations, these pedagogical functions were useful not just for the students themselves, but also for the professionals present in the room, so especially priests, but in the case of theology, but also, of course, physicians and lawyers who were watching disputations in their own subjects. And we know that disputations were also taken seriously by students themselves and by the professors. For the students, they could be a means of impressing a potential patron in the audience, helping them obtain a fellowship or even a professorship, right? So disputations were also, as I've suggested, not just for the benefit of members of the university. And this is, of course, I think, a far easier point to make for continental universities where disputations, or at least parts of them, might be printed in hundreds of copies. They sold well, they enjoyed a wide readership, and were, as a historian recently put it, an important genre of scholarly publication. But part of what I want to say today is that even in England, where only the verses were printed, and even then didn't circulate very widely, graduation disputations nevertheless still had a public-facing role. Importantly, even though the theses weren't printed, they nevertheless were able to reach an audience even beyond those who were present in the room. And we know this because there's many examples of those who were present taking copious notes, which they then shared with their friends, with their colleagues, and even at times with dignitaries like ambassadors, for example, who explicitly try and seek after these records when they weren't able to make a disputation in person. In addition to this, accounts of disputations from eyewitnesses were often printed, and they were usually taken straightforwardly as evidence of the university's position on a given topic. Often this work was undertaken, this kind of publication work was undertaken by those who disagreed with the position that was being advocated. As for example, in 1687, a group of Jesuits come to Oxford specifically in order to pick holes in divinity disputations. So I've suggested that Oxford disputations are also useful for understanding the topics that were felt to be both pedagogically and publicly or even politically important in certain moments. They're a useful litmus test for the official line, or at least the line that important members of the university wanted to put forward, and that they felt was necessary to defend during key moments of debate. And this is in part why I think they're useful for helping us to approach the broader question of the marginalisation of astrology, of course, one of the major transformations in history of science in the early modern period. In the case of Oxbridge, I think what we're seeing is that public disputations against astrology are contributing to a climate or a culture in which practicing and researching astrology is discouraged, contributing ultimately to the marginalisation or sort of privatization of astrological research and even teaching. We now know a great deal about how astrology was taught in medieval and Renaissance universities, but the process of removing it from the curriculum is still something we have yet to kind of fully figure out. And other historians have used disputations at various continental universities to approach these questions with really great effect. And I'm thinking in particular of these two books, but there's much other work on this as well. And there's also much more work to be done. And I mean, what I think would be really fantastic is to see some kind of broad, comparative, systematic study across early modern universities, which would admittedly be no mean feat considering the great reams of evidence. But I think one can dream. And I'm going to finish there. Thank you so much.